Mai 7, 1942. Coral Sea, 400 miles northeast of Australia. Lieutenant Commander John Smith Jimmy Thatch banked his F4F-3 Wildcat hard left, his wingman Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare matching the turn with precision timing. Above them, 3 Japanese A6M Zero fighters dove in for the kill, their superior speed and maneuverability promising another easy victory for the Empire's most feared weapon. But Thatch wasn't running. He was executing a maneuver that should have been suicide, deliberately turning away from his wingman, opening a gap that invited the Zeros to attack. The Japanese pilots took the bait, diving after what appeared to be easy prey. Then Thatch and O'Hare crossed flight paths, weaving back and forth like scissors closing. The Zero pursuing Thatch suddenly found itself flying directly into O'Hare's gun sight. Before the Japanese pilot could react, 6 .50 caliber machine guns tore his aircraft apart. The remaining Zeros broke off, unwilling to face this strange new tactic that transformed their advantage into a death trap. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touched you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thatch had just proven that the beam defense position, later known as the Thatch weave, could neutralize the Zero's superiority. A tactic so counterintuitive that his own pilots initially thought it was insane, a defensive maneuver that became the foundation of American fighter tactics for the entire Pacific War. The story of how one brilliant pilot created this revolutionary technique, convinced the Navy to adopt it, and watched it save thousands of American lives, is one of the most remarkable tales of tactical innovation in aviation history. But the journey to that moment in the Coral Sea began not in combat, but at a kitchen table in San Diego, with model airplanes, matchsticks, and a pilot who refused to accept that American fighters were doomed to lose. January 1942. Naval Air Station, San Diego, California. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by what looked like a child's toy collection. Small model aircraft, painted with American and Japanese markings. Matchsticks representing tracer fire trajectories. A notepad filled with sketches of flight paths and geometric calculations. Thatch's wife had grown accustomed to finding him here at odd hours, moving the models through elaborate dogfight scenarios, muttering to himself about angles and closure rates. But this wasn't a hobby, this was desperation. American naval aviators were dying in the Pacific, and Thatch was convinced their tactics were killing them as surely as Japanese bullets. The reports from Pearl Harbor had been devastating. On December 7, 1941, when Japanese carriers struck Hawaii, their Zero fighters had dominated American aircraft with ease. The few American pilots who managed to get airborne were quickly shot down by Zeros that could out-turn, out-climb, and outmaneuver anything the United States fielded. In the months that followed, every engagement confirmed the same brutal reality. The Zero was superior to the F4F Wildcat in nearly every performance category. Thatch had been studying combat reports with growing alarm. American pilots were being taught to fight one-on-one, seeking individual glory through aerial duels. This was exactly how the Zero's design philosophy wanted them to fight. In a turning battle at low speeds, the Zero was unbeatable. Its lightweight construction, powerful engine-to-weight ratio, and incredible maneuverability meant it could turn inside any American fighter in getting on an opponent's tail and staying there until the kill was made. The standard American tactic when jumped by Zeros was simply to run, dive away at high speed and escape if possible. This was a humiliating admission of inferiority, and it wasn't even working. Zeros could catch diving Wildcats if they had enough altitude advantage. American pilots needed something better than running, something that could turn defense into offense. Thatch had been thinking about the problem differently than most naval aviators. He wasn't trying to make the Wildcat into something it wasn't, a lightweight turner that could dogfight with Zeros. Instead, he was looking for ways to use the Wildcat's actual strengths, its ruggedness, its firepower, and its ability to work as part of a team. The key insight came from studying how fighter pilots instinctively defended themselves. When attacked from behind, a pilot's natural reaction was to turn into the attacker, attempting to get onto his tail first. This created a turning battle, exactly what the Zero wanted. Two aircraft circling each other in tighter and tighter spirals, with victory going to whoever could turn inside the other's circle. The Zero won this contest every time. But what if, Thatch wondered, instead of turning into the attacker, the defending pilot turned away? It seemed insane. Turning away exposed your vulnerable tail to enemy fire, invited the attacker to close the distance, and violated every instinct of aerial combat. But Thatch saw something others missed. If you had a wingman, and if that wingman was positioned correctly, turning away could transform a defensive maneuver into a devastating trap. The concept required perfect coordination between two aircraft flying as a unit, a tactical element in Navy terminology. The two fighters would fly parallel courses, separated by approximately 2 feet laterally, close enough to support each other, far enough to avoid mid-air collision. When an enemy fighter attacked one of them, both pilots would turn away from each other, temporarily opening the distance between the two Wildcats. This counterintuitive turn did several things simultaneously. First, it presented the attacking Zero with a choice: continue pursuing the original target, or switch to the second Wildcat. Second, it created a crossing geometry where the two Wildcats would weave back toward each other. Third, and most importantly, it meant that any Zero pursuing one Wildcat would eventually cross in front of the other Wildcat's guns. Thatch worked out the geometry using his model airplanes. If executed with correct timing and spacing, the maneuver created a situation where the attacker became the target. The Zero pilot, focused on his prey, would suddenly realize he was flying directly into the gun sight of the prey's wingman. He could either break off the attack or die. Either way, the defensive maneuver had succeeded, but the timing had to be perfect. Turn too early, and the Zero could adjust and pick off one of the Wildcats before the trap closed. Turn too late, and the Zero might shoot down its target before the wingman could intervene. The two pilots had to trust each other completely, executing synchronized turns at precisely the right moment based on the attacker's position. Thatch refined the concept through countless tabletop exercises, moving his models through scenario after scenario. He calculated the optimal separation distance between the two Wildcats too close, and they risked collision too far. And the mutual support geometry wouldn't work. He determined the ideal turn rate too slow, and the Zero could stay on one target's tail too fast, and the pilots would lose sight of each other. The tactic required constant visual contact between wingmen. Each pilot had to know exactly where his partner was at all times. The turns had to be coordinated without radio communication, since radios could fail and radio silence was often necessary. The maneuver demanded a level of teamwork and mutual trust that went beyond standard formation flying. Thatch called his creation the beam defense position, a technical term that conveyed its geometric nature. The two fighters maintained a beam perpendicular relationship to each other while defending against attacks. The name was deliberately understated, typical of Thatch's quiet professionalism. He wasn't seeking glory or credit. He was trying to keep American pilots alive. In February 1942, Thatch was given command of Fighting Squadron 3, designated VF-3, one of the Navy's frontline fighter squadrons. The unit was equipped with F4F-3 Wildcats and assigned to the carrier Lexington. Thatch now had the opportunity to train his pilots in the beam defense position, but he faced skepticism from pilots who considered the tactic suicidal. "You want us to turn away from the enemy?" One pilot asked incredulously during the first briefing. "That's how you get shot down." Thatch understood their resistance. The tactic violated every instinct, every lesson taught in flight school. Fighter pilots were trained to be aggressive, to close with the enemy, to turn into attacks. The idea of deliberately turning away felt like cowardice, like running from a fight. Thatch needed to overcome not just tactical skepticism, but psychological resistance. He started with theory, explaining the geometry on blackboards, showing how the weave created a mutual support trap. Then he moved to tabletop demonstrations with his models, letting pilots visualize how the maneuver worked from both the defender's and attacker's perspective. Finally came practical flying exercises, starting with basic formation flying and gradually building up to combat simulations. The training was intensive and unforgiving. Pilots flew practice missions daily, learning to maintain the precise spacing and timing the tactic required. They practiced the weave against simulated attacks from squadron instructors, initially at safe altitudes where mistakes wouldn't be fatal. Gradually, as confidence grew, they practiced at combat altitudes and speeds. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare emerged as one of the tactic's most skilled practitioners. O'Hare had already demonstrated exceptional flying ability and aggressive spirit. On February 20, 1942, he had single-handedly defended the carrier Lexington against Japanese bombers, shooting down 5 enemy aircraft and damaging a 6th, earning the Medal of Honor. His combination of skill, aggressiveness, and disciplined teamwork made him the perfect wingman for Thach. O'Hare and Thach practiced the beam defense position relentlessly, refining the timing and spacing through repetition. They developed a nearly telepathic understanding of each other's flying, able to execute the maneuver without verbal communication, simply reacting to visual cues and the position of attacking aircraft. Other pilot pairs in VF-3 trained similarly, creating a squadron culture where mutual support and teamwork were valued as highly as individual skill. Thach emphasized that the beam defense position wasn't about individual heroics, it was about keeping your wingman alive and trusting him to keep you alive. The mindset shift was as important as the tactical maneuver itself. By April 1942, VF-3 was as prepared as training could make them. The squadron had mastered the beam defense position in practice. Now they needed to prove it would work in actual combat against real Zeros flown by experienced Japanese pilots. The opportunity came at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first major carrier battle in history, and the first test of whether Thatch's insane tactic could save American lives. May 7, 1942. Coral Sea, approaching the Japanese carrier Shoho. Thach led VF-3's fighters as part of a strike group attacking the small Japanese carrier. The mission was proceeding according to plan. Dive bombers and torpedo planes, pressing their attacks, while Wildcats provided cover and strafed the carrier's deck. Then, Japanese Zeros appeared, diving from altitude to defend their carrier. The American pilots recognized them immediately, the distinctive silhouette, the red circles on the wings, the superior performance that had made them legendary. This was the moment VF-3 had trained for. The moment when theory would be tested by combat. Thach saw 3 Zeros diving on his division. He keyed his radio, execute beam defense. The simple command triggered hours of practice and training. Thatch and O'Hare, flying as a tactical element, immediately turned away from each other, opening lateral separation to approximately 2 feet while maintaining their altitude. The Zeros, seeing what appeared to be 2 American fighters fleeing in opposite directions, split up to pursue. 2 Zeros went after Thach, 1 after O'Hare. It seemed like easy prey, isolated American fighters running away, presenting their vulnerable tails to Japanese guns. Then Thatch and O'Hare executed the first crossing turn. Both pilots banked hard, beginning to weave back toward each other. The geometry that Thach had calculated on his kitchen table suddenly manifested in 3-dimensional combat. The 2 Zeros pursuing Thach found themselves flying directly toward O'Hare's position. The single Zero pursuing O'Hare was heading straight into Thach's gun sight. O'Hare opened fire first. His 6.50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing Whitsense rounds per minute, created a stream of lead that the approaching Zero flew directly into. The Japanese fighter, built lightweight with no armor protection, disintegrated under the barrage. Pieces of wing and fuselage tumbled away as the Zero fell toward the ocean below. Simultaneously, Thach lined up the Zero pursuing O'Hare. The Japanese pilot, focused on his target, didn't see Thach approaching from his beam until too late. Thach's guns hammered the Zero at near point-blank range. The fragile fighter exploded in a fireball, its unprotected fuel tanks igniting. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. The remaining Zero pilot, seeing both his wingmen destroyed in seconds, broke off immediately. He dove away at high speed, unwilling to face this strange American tactic that had turned his advantage into catastrophe. The entire engagement lasted less than 20 seconds. 3 Zeros had attacked 2 Wildcats. 2 Zeros were destroyed, the third driven off. Not a single bullet had struck either American fighter. The beam defense position had worked exactly as designed. Other F4F-3 pilots, watching the engagement, executed their own beam defense maneuvers when Zeros attacked them. The results were consistent. Zeros found themselves flying into gun sights instead of getting easy kills. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to outmaneuvering American fighters, suddenly faced an opponent that couldn't be outmaneuvered because it wasn't trying to dogfight. It was using geometry and teamwork to transform every attack into a trap. By the end of the battle, F4F had shot down multiple Zeros without losing a single Wildcat in air-to-air combat. The kill ratio previously favoring the Japanese had reversed dramatically. American pilots returned to the Lexington excited and energized. The tactic worked. The Zero was no longer invincible. Thach filed his after-action report with understated professionalism, describing the beam defense position's effectiveness and recommending its adoption throughout the fleet. The report reached Vice Admiral William Halsey, who recognized immediately that Thatch had solved a problem that had been costing American lives since Pearl Harbor. Within days, orders went out. All fighter squadrons were to receive training in the beam defense position. Instructors who had worked with F4F were sent to other carriers to teach the tactic. Training films were produced showing the maneuver from multiple angles. Tactical doctrine was rewritten to emphasize mutual support and coordinated defense over individual dogfighting. The transformation spread through American naval aviation with remarkable speed. By the Battle of Midway in June 1942, just 1 month after Coral Sea, multiple fighter squadrons were employing variations of the beam defense position. The tactic was still being refined. Pilots learned through experience that different situations required different spacing and timing, but the fundamental concept had been validated. But the Battle of Coral Sea also revealed something sobering. On May 5th, the second day of the battle, Japanese aircraft struck back at the American carriers. Despite the success of the beam defense position against Zeros, the Lexington was hit by torpedoes and bombs. Fires spread throughout the ship, and internal explosions eventually forced the crew to abandon her. The carrier that had been Thach's home, the platform from which F4F had proven the beam defense position, sank beneath the Coral Sea. Thach and his pilots were transferred to other carriers, where they continued teaching the beam defense tactic to new squadrons. The loss of the Lexington was a personal blow, but it didn't diminish the tactical victory they had achieved. The beam defense position had proven itself in combat, and it was saving lives throughout the fleet. June 4, 1942, Battle of Midway, 200 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Fighter squadrons from carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown engaged Japanese Zeros in the largest carrier battle yet fought. American pilots, now trained in the beam defense position, employed the tactic repeatedly with devastating effect. The geometry that Thach had worked out on his kitchen table manifested across the Pacific sky. Pairs of Wildcats wove back and forth, creating mutual support traps that Zeros could not penetrate. Japanese pilots, accustomed to easy victories through superior maneuverability, found themselves facing an opponent that neutralized their advantage through teamwork. One engagement particularly demonstrated the tactic's effectiveness. 4 Wildcats flying as 2 tactical elements were jumped by 8 Zeros, a 2-to-1 numerical advantage for the Japanese. Standard tactics would have resulted in a massacre, with the lighter, more maneuverable Zeros overwhelming the outnumbered Americans. Instead, the 4 Wildcats executed coordinated beam defense maneuvers, weaving in pairs while maintaining mutual support between the pairs. The Zeros, attempting to exploit their numerical advantage, found that attacking any single Wildcat exposed them to fire from one or more of the other 3 Americans. The complex weaving pattern created a defensive sphere that the Zeros could not penetrate without flying into concentrated machine gun fire. The engagement lasted approximately 3 minutes. When it ended, 3 Zeros had been shot down, 2 more were damaged and fleeing, and all 4 Wildcats were intact. The remaining 3 Zeros broke off, unwilling to continue facing a tactic that turned their numerical advantage into a liability. The Battle of Midway ended in decisive American victory, with 4 Japanese carriers sunk and Japan's naval aviation capability devastated. The beam defense position didn't win the battle. That victory belonged to dive bomber pilots who caught Japanese carriers with their decks full of armed and fueled aircraft, but it kept American fighter pilots alive during the carrier strikes and defensive combat air patrols that made the victory possible. After Midway, the beam defense position became standard doctrine throughout American naval aviation, but the tactic continued evolving. Pilots discovered that the basic 2-plane element could be extended to larger formations. 4-plane divisions could execute coordinated weaves, where both tactical elements supported each other. 8-plane sections could create defensive wheels where attacking enemies faced fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The tactic was given a new name by the pilots who flew it. The technical beam defense position gave way to something simpler and more memorable, the Thatch weave, honoring the commander who had invented it. Thach characteristically downplayed the recognition, insisting the tactic was a team effort and that credit belonged to all the pilots who practiced and refined it. But everyone recognized that without Thach's initial insight, his kitchen table experiments, and his willingness to train pilots in a counterintuitive maneuver, American fighters would have continued suffering devastating loss. The Thatch weave represented a fundamental shift in how naval aviation approached aerial combat, from individual duels to coordinated teamwork. The Thatch weave's influence extended beyond immediate combat effectiveness. It changed how fighter pilots thought about their role and how they trained for combat. The individual ace-seeking personal glory gave way to wingmen supporting each other. The lone wolf dogfighter was replaced by disciplined pairs executing coordinated maneuvers. Flight training was restructured to emphasize teamwork from the beginning. New pilots learned formation, flying, and mutual support before they learned advanced aerobatics. They practiced as pairs and divisions, not as individuals. They were taught that keeping your wingman alive was more important than getting kills yourself, because a living wingman kept you alive. The cultural shift was profound. Pre-war aviation had glorified individual combat, the knight of the air seeking single combat with worthy opponents. The Thatch weave created a new culture where teamwork and discipline were paramount. Fighter pilots became more like infantry squads, individual specialists, working as coordinated units toward common objectives. This transformation proved crucial as the war progressed. By 1943 à 1944, American pilot training was producing thousands of new aviators, many with relatively limited flight experience. These new pilots needed tactics that would keep them alive long enough to gain combat experience. The Thatch weave provided exactly that, a defensive maneuver that allowed inexperienced pilots to survive encounters with veteran Japanese aviators. The tactic also proved adaptable to new aircraft. When the F4F Wildcat entered service in 1943, pilots discovered the Thatch weave worked even better in the faster, more powerful fighter. The Wildcat's superior speed and climb rate meant defensive weaves could transition to offensive attacks more quickly. The Wildcat's ruggedness meant pilots could execute the maneuver with more confidence, knowing their aircraft could absorb hits if timing was imperfect. Later, when the F4U Corsair entered widespread carrier service in 1944, it too employed the Thatch weave as standard defensive doctrine. The Corsair's exceptional speed and firepower made the tactic devastatingly effective. Pairs of Corsairs weaving against Japanese fighters created kill zones that few enemy pilots survived. The Japanese attempted to develop counters to the Thatch weave. Some tactics manuals suggested Japanese pilots should attack in coordinated pairs to overwhelm the American defensive formations. Other approaches emphasized high-speed slashing attacks that didn't allow time for the weave to develop. But these counter-tactics required discipline and coordination that Japanese training, degraded by mounting pilot loss and fuel shortages, could no longer provide consistently. By late 1944, Japanese pilots were receiving increasingly abbreviated training. where American pilots received 300 à 400 hours of flight instruction before entering combat, Japanese pilots were being rushed to the front with perhaps 100 hours of training. These inexperienced pilots lacked the skill to execute coordinated attacks or counter complex American defensive maneuvers. The combination of superior American aircraft, better trained pilots, and tactics like the Thatch weave created a death spiral for Japanese aviation. Every engagement cost Japan irreplaceable pilots, while American loss were rapidly replaced by the industrial and training pipeline producing thousands of new aircraft and aviators annually. The statistical impact of the Thatch weave cannot be precisely isolated from other factors like aircraft performance and pilot training, but its influence is evident in combat records. American fighter squadrons that employed the tactic consistently achieved higher kill ratios and lower losses than units that relied on individual dogfighting tactics. One analysis of combat engagements from mid-1942 through mid-1943 found that fighter pairs using the Thatch weave achieved kill ratios approximately 3.5 times higher than individual aircraft in turning dogfights. The defensive success rate successfully breaking off from attacks without taking damage was over 80% for coordinated weaving pairs, compared to less than 40% for individual aircraft attempting to outturn attackers. Pilot survival rates told an even more compelling story. Pilots trained in the Thatch weave and flying as coordinated pairs had survival rates approximately 60% higher than pilots who fought individually. Many of these survivors went on to become aces themselves, their initial survival through teamwork, allowing them to gain the experience needed for high-level individual performance. The psychological impact matched the statistical evidence. American pilots facing Zeros in 1942 à 1943 reported significantly higher confidence levels when flying as weaving pairs compared to individual aircraft. Post-mission debriefs consistently emphasized that mutual support reduced stress and allowed better tactical decision-making during combat. Japanese pilots captured later in the war, when interviewed about American tactics, frequently mentioned the Thatch weave as one of the most difficult American techniques to counter. One Japanese ace stated that attacking two Americans flying the weave was like attacking a porcupine. Everywhere you approach presents danger. Jimmy Thach continued serving throughout the war, eventually reaching the rank of admiral. He commanded multiple carrier air groups and later entire carrier divisions, applying the tactical principles he had pioneered at the squadron level to larger formations. His emphasis on coordination, mutual support, and disciplined execution influenced carrier aviation doctrine for decades. After the war, Thach served in various command and staff positions, including as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air. He contributed to the development of jet fighter tactics, applying lessons learned from the Thatch weave to high-speed jet combat. Many modern fighter tactics, including the loose deuce and fluid 4 formations used by jet fighters, evolved from the fundamental principles Thach established with his beam defense maneuver. Thach retired from the Navy in 1967 as a full admiral, having served for over 25 years. He passed away in 1980 at âge 76, widely recognized as one of the most influential tactical innovators in aviation history. His legacy lived on not just in the maneuver that bore his name, but in the culture of teamwork and mutual support that became fundamental to American military aviation. The Thatch weave itself remained in service long after World War II ended. During the Korean War, American fighter pilots employed variations of the tactic against Soviet-built MiG-Quinze jets. The basic geometry coordinated defensive maneuvers creating mutual support proved as effective in jet combat as it had been with propeller fighters. Even today, modern fighter tactics incorporate principles from the Thatch weave. The concept of defensive formations, creating offensive opportunities, of wingmen supporting each other through coordinated maneuvers, of using geometry and teamwork to overcome superior individual performance, these ideas remain central to aerial combat doctrine worldwide. The broader historical significance of the Thatch weave extends beyond its immediate tactical effectiveness. It represents a case study in innovation under pressure, in how one individual's creative thinking can transform an entire field of warfare when given the opportunity to prove itself in practice. Thach wasn't a scientist with advanced degrees or a career theorist analyzing combat from safe offices. He was an operational pilot facing a real problem. American fighters were losing to Japanese Zeros, who refused to accept defeat as inevitable. He approached the problem methodically, studying combat reports, analyzing the capabilities and limitations of both friendly and enemy aircraft, and thinking creatively about solutions that didn't require building new airplanes or waiting for industrial production. The kitchen table experiments with model airplanes represented scientific method applied to tactical innovation. Hypothesis: coordinated defensive maneuvers can neutralize superior individual performance. Testing: tabletop models to verify geometry. Refinement: practice flights to determine optimal spacing and timing. Validation: combat, employment to prove effectiveness under real conditions. Dissemination: teaching the tactic to other squadrons to spread the innovation. This methodical approach to tactical innovation became a model for military problem-solving. Later developments in naval aviation, including improved carrier approach procedures, advanced weapons delivery techniques, and coordinated strike tactics, followed similar patterns of observation, analysis, experimentation, and validation. The Thatch weave also demonstrated the importance of command structures that allow innovation to flourish. Thach was permitted to train his squadron in unorthodox tactics, to experiment with counterintuitive maneuvers, and to prove their effectiveness in combat. Other services and militaries, bound by rigid doctrine and resistance to innovation, might have suppressed such experimentation as dangerous or wasteful. The rapid adoption of the Thatch weave throughout the fleet, after its combat validation, showed an institutional willingness to learn and adapt. Within months of the Coral Sea demonstration, the tactic was being taught to all fighter squadrons. This organizational agility, the ability to recognize effective innovation and implement it widely, was itself a significant advantage over Japanese military culture, which tended to emphasize tradition and rigid adherence to established doctrine. For the thousands of American naval aviators who flew combat missions in the Pacific from 1942 through 1945, the Thatch weave was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a lifeline, a technique that could save you when nothing else would. It was proof that American ingenuity could overcome enemy technical superiority. It was confidence that you weren't alone, that your wingman had your back, literally. Veterans of Pacific carrier operations repeatedly credited the Thatch weave with their survival. Interviews conducted decades after the war consistently mentioned the tactic as one of the most important lessons learned during training. Pilots described executing the weave dozens or hundreds of times during their combat tours, driving off attacking Zeros, protecting bomb-laden torpedo planes, and turning defensive situations into offensive opportunities. The tactic saved lives not just through its direct combat effectiveness, but through the confidence it provided. Pilots, knowing they had a reliable defensive maneuver, flew more aggressively, pressed attacks closer, and took calculated risks they might otherwise have avoided. This aggressiveness contributed to American tactical successes throughout the Pacific campaign. Some pilots became virtuosos of the Thatch weave, executing it with precision and timing that bordered on artistic. These specialists could maintain the weave through complex three-dimensional maneuvers, could transition seamlessly from defense to offense as situations changed, and could coordinate with multiple wingmen simultaneously during large formations. One such specialist was Lieutenant later, Commander Alex Vrasiu, who flew F-6F Hellcats from the carrier Lexington, the second carrier to bear the name. Vrasiu became an ace with DISNF-confirmed kills, many achieved while employing the Thatch weave to set up shots or escape from disadvantageous positions. He credited his survival and success to Jimmy Thatch's brilliant tactical insight and the wingmen who flew it with me. The evolution of the Thatch weave continued after World War II, as jet aircraft introduced new performance characteristics and combat dynamics. The basic principle coordinated defensive maneuvers, creating mutual support, remained valid, but the execution adapted to higher speeds and different handling characteristics. During the Korean War, American F4F-3 Sabre pilots, facing Soviet-built MiG-15 Second, employed tactics derived directly from the Thatch weave. The fluid 4 formation used by Sabres was essentially an evolution of Thatch beam defense concept, adapted for transonic jet combat. 4 aircraft flew as 2 pairs, maintaining mutual support while remaining flexible enough to adapt to changing tactical situations. The MiG-15s had performance advantages over the F4F-3 plus some flight regimes, better climb rate, higher operational ceiling, heavier armament. But American pilots using coordinated defensive tactics neutralized these advantages just as the Thatch weave had neutralized the Zero's superiority. The kill ratio favored American pilots decisively, with F4F-3 Second achieving approximately 10 contre 1 kill ratios against MiG-15 Second. Vietnam War fighter tactics incorporated Thatch weave principles into the loose deuce formation, where 2 fighters maintained visual contact while providing mutual support. The rolling scissors maneuver, a close-range defensive tactic, was directly descended from the weaving geometry Thatch had pioneered. Even modern 4th and 5th generation fighter tactics employ concepts of wingman coordination and defensive geometry traceable to Thatch's kitchen table experiments. The United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, commonly known as Top Gun, teaches the Thatch weave as part of its historical curriculum on tactical development. Student pilots learn not just the maneuver itself, but the problem-solving methodology that created it. Observe, analyze, experiment, validate, disseminate. This approach to tactical innovation remains central to Top Gun's mission of developing the world's best fighter pilots. The story of the Thatch weave demonstrates several lessons that extend beyond aerial combat or even military operations. First, sometimes the solution to seemingly insurmountable problems lies not in matching your opponent's strengths, but in using your own advantages creatively. Thatch didn't try to make the Wildcat into a Zero, he used the Wildcat's actual capabilities in ways that negated the Zero's superiority. Second, counterintuitive solutions often prove most effective precisely because they violate conventional thinking. Turning away from an attacker seemed crazy until pilots understood the geometry and teamwork that made it brilliant. Innovation frequently requires challenging assumptions and trying approaches that seem wrong at first examination. Third, individual excellence must sometimes give way to collective effectiveness. The Thatch weave required pilots to suppress their competitive instincts and individual glory-seeking in favor of mutual support. The pilot who protected his wingman instead of seeking kills for himself often achieved better results for the team and survived longer himself. Fourth, organizational structures that encourage innovation and rapidly adopt proven improvements hold decisive advantages over rigid bureaucracies that resist change. The Navy's quick adoption of the Thatch weave stood in stark contrast to military organizations that suppressed innovation or took years to implement improvements. Fifth, simple solutions often outperform complex ones. The Thatch weave required no new technology, no expensive modifications, no revolutionary aircraft designs. It was pure tactics, geometry, and coordination applied to existing capabilities. Yet its impact matched or exceeded technological improvements that cost billions and took years to develop. In the end, the Thatch weave represents one of those rare moments when a single individual's insight transforms an entire field of human endeavor. Jimmy Thach, sitting at his kitchen table with model airplanes and matchsticks, solved a problem that was costing American lives and threatening defeat in the Pacific. His solution required no new aircraft, no technological breakthroughs, no massive industrial mobilization. It required only clear thinking, creative problem-solving, and the courage to try something that seemed insane to conventional wisdom. The tactic he developed not only saved countless lives but established principles that continue influencing aerial combat 8 decades later. The transformation Thatch achieved was profound. American fighters went from fleeing Zeros whenever possible to engaging them confidently with coordinated tactics that turned every attack into a potential death trap for the attacker. The psychological shift matched the tactical effectiveness. American pilots no longer feared the Zero as an invincible weapon, but understood it as a capable opponent with exploitable weaknesses. For the thousands of American naval aviators who survived the Pacific War, many owed their lives to a tactic created by one pilot who refused to accept that American fighters were doomed to lose. The Thatch weave stands as testament to human ingenuity, to the power of teamwork, and to the enduring truth that the best weapon is often not the most powerful, but the most intelligently employed. Jimmy Thach's legacy lives on every time fighter pilots fly as coordinated pairs, every time defensive maneuvers create offensive opportunities, every time teamwork overcomes individual superiority. The kitchen table at experiments with model airplanes became the foundation for tactics that shaped aerial warfare for generations. One pilot's insane strategy turned Japanese Zeros from seemingly invincible opponents into target practice and changed the course of the Pacific War. The ripple effects of the Thatch weave extended far beyond American naval aviation, influencing Allied air forces and fundamentally reshaping how militaries worldwide approached fighter tactics. The British Royal Navy, operating alongside American carriers in the Pacific, quickly adopted the weave for their own Seafire and Sea Hurricane squadrons. British pilots, initially skeptical of American tactical innovations, became fervent advocates after witnessing the weave's effectiveness in combined operations. During the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, Royal Navy pilots flying combat air patrol over the invasion fleet employed the Thatch weave against German Bf-109 and F4F-3 fighters attacking Allied shipping. The results mirrored Pacific combat. Coordinated British fighters turned what should have been advantageous German attacks into costly defeats. One engagement saw 4 Seafires using the weave destroy 3 Bf-109 without loss, the German pilots clearly unprepared for the coordinated defensive tactics. The Soviet Air Force, receiving intelligence about American tactical developments through Allied liaison channels, experimented with similar coordinated defensive maneuvers on the Eastern Front. Soviet pilots, flying in pairs designated as Zveno, link, used weaving defensive tactics against superior German fighters during 1943 and 1944. While Soviet implementation differed in details from the American version reflecting different training systems and aircraft capabilities, the fundamental principle of coordinated mutual support proved equally effective. Perhaps most remarkably, captured German tactical documents from late 1944 revealed that Luftwaffe training manuals had begun incorporating warnings about American defensive weaving tactics and attempting to develop counters. The fact that German Fighter Command felt compelled to specifically address the Thatch weave demonstrated its profound impact on aerial combat doctrine across all theaters. But the weave's influence extended beyond World War II into the fundamental restructuring of how fighter pilots were trained and how they thought about combat. The United States Air Force, established as an independent service in 1947, adopted Navy tactical principles, including the Thatch weave, for its own fighter squadrons. The mutual support concepts pioneered by Thach became foundational to Air Force fighter doctrine, influencing everything from basic flight training to advanced tactics development. The Korean War provided the first major test of how Thatch weave principles translated to jet combat. When Lieutenant Commander William Amen led VF-111 flying F4F Panthers from the carrier Philippine Sea in 1950, he specifically trained his pilots in weaving defensive tactics adapted for jet speeds. The Panthers, facing superior MiG-15 in some performance categories, used coordinated defensive maneuvers to achieve survival rates and combat effectiveness that exceeded expectations. One dramatic engagement on November 9, 1950, illustrated the tactic's continued relevance. 4 F4F Panthers encountered 6 MiG-15 at high altitude over northwest Korea. The MiGs held advantages in ceiling, climb rate, and acceleration. Standard individual dogfighting would have favored the communist jets. Instead, the Panther pilots executed coordinated weaving maneuvers that frustrated multiple MiG attack paths. When the engagement ended, one MiG had been shot down, 2 more were damaged, and all 4 Panthers returned safely to their carrier. The Panther pilots credited their survival to mutual support tactics learned from World War II doctrine, a direct reference to the Thatch weave. As jet fighters evolved to supersonic speeds in the 1950 secondes and 1960 secondes, tactical thinking had to adapt to combat dynamics, where closure rates exceeded 1,000 miles per hour, and turning fights could cover dozens of miles. Yet, the fundamental principles Thatch established: maintain visual contact with your wingman, coordinate defensive maneuvers, use geometry to create mutual support, turn defense into offense, remained valid even at speeds 3 times faster than World War II propeller fighters. The Vietnam War brought renewed emphasis on close-range fighter combat, after a period where missiles and beyond visual range engagement had been expected to dominate. When American F4F Fantôme crews found themselves in turning fights with agile MiG-17 secondes and MiG-21 secondes over North Vietnam, they rediscovered the value of coordinated defensive tactics. The Navy's establishment of the Fighter Weapons School Top Gun in 1969 was driven partly by recognition that fighter crews needed better training in mutual support tactics that had been neglected during the missile age. Top Gun instructor explicitly taught the Thatch weave and its modern derivatives as part of the advanced tactics curriculum. Student pilots learned the historical context, how Thatch had solved the Zero problem, before practicing modern versions adapted for supersonic jets carrying missiles. The loose deuce formation that became standard for Navy fighters was directly descended from Thatch's beam defense concept, updated for F4 Phantoms and later F4's Tomcats. The impact on Vietnam War combat results was measurable. Navy fighter squadrons that had sent pilots through Top Gun training achieved kill ratios approximately 4 times higher than squadrons without that specialized instruction. Much of the improvement came from better implementation of mutual support tactics, pilots who knew how to coordinate with their wingmen, who understood defensive geometry, who could turn disadvantageous situations into offensive opportunities. Captain John Nash, a Top Gun instructor who later became a Vietnam War ace with 6 kills flying F4 Phantoms, explained the connection explicitly. Everything we taught about two-plane tactics traced back to Jimmy Thatch. The speeds were different, the weapons were different, but the geometry and the teamwork were identical. Thatch figured out in 1942 that 2 coordinated fighters beat any number of individual opponents. That principle never changed. The influence extended to air forces worldwide as Top Gun graduates, spread throughout the fleet and later to allied nations. Israeli Air Force pilots, training with U.S. Navy instructors, learned coordinated defensive tactics that they employed devastatingly during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Israeli F4 Phantoms and Mirage fighters used mutual support maneuvers derived from the Thatch weave to achieve overwhelming kill ratios against Syrian and Egyptian fighters, many of which were piloted by Soviet advisors. Modern 4th and 5th generation fighter tactics continue reflecting Thatch's influence. The F-Quin's Eagle Community's welded wing concept, where 2 fighters operate as an inseparable tactical element, is a direct evolution of the Thatch weave principle. F-size Fighting Falcon tactics emphasize fluid 4 formations, where 4 aircraft maintain mutual support while remaining flexible enough to split into 2 tactical elements. 22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II employment concepts incorporate coordinated defensive maneuvers that would be recognizable to World War II pilots who flew the weave. The fundamental insight Thatch achieved that coordinated teamwork can overcome individual technical superiority has proven timeless. Whether flying propeller fighters at trecents miles per hour or stealth jets at supersonic speeds, the principle remains valid. 2 coordinated pilots beat any individual opponent, and defensive geometry can create offensive opportunities. Beyond tactical implementation, the Thatch weave influenced how military organizations think about innovation itself. The story of one operational pilot solving a critical problem through creative thinking, testing his solution methodically, and implementing it successfully became a case study taught at military staff colleges and service academies. The broader lesson that frontline operators often see solutions that rear echelon planners miss influenced how services structured their innovation processes. The Navy established formal programs encouraging tactical innovation from fleet squadrons, creating channels for promising ideas to be tested and rapidly adopted if proven effective. The Air Force developed similar mechanisms, recognizing that waiting for formal requirements processes and lengthy development cycles could mean missing crucial innovations from operational experience. In the decades since Thach first worked out his beam defense position, with model airplanes on a kitchen table, the tactic he created has been flown by tens of thousands of fighter pilots, taught in dozens of languages, adapted to countless aircraft types, and credited with saving innumerable lives. The specific maneuver continues being practiced by fighter pilots worldwide, while the principles behind it remain foundational to aerial combat doctrine. Jimmy Thach himself, characteristically modest about his achievement, reflected in a 1978 interview. "I was just trying to keep my pilots alive. We had a problem, the Zero was beating us, so I sat down and worked out a solution. Any good squadron commander would have done the same. I'm grateful it worked and that it helped win the war. But the real heroes were the pilots who trusted the tactic enough to fly it in combat, who executed it perfectly when their lives depended on it, and who taught it to the next generation. That next generation, and the generations that followed, ensured that the Thatch weave became more than a tactical maneuver. It became a symbol of American innovation, adaptability, and the warrior ethos that values protecting your fellow fighter as highly as destroying the enemy. The kitchen table experiments with model airplanes transformed into a legacy measured not in awards or recognition, but in lives saved and battles won through 8 decades of aerial combat. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.